Hello everyone and welcome to this Global Government Forum webinar looking at how the public sector in the UK can better join up data and digital systems to improve public services. My name is Richard Johnston and I'm the Executive Editor of Global Government Forum, which is focused on bringing together public and civil servants from around the world to share best practice. Although today we're focused on the UK and the UK public sector and how can we make sure that data helps unlock better public services for everybody, which is, I'm sure you will agree, a very pertinent topic. So I'm really excited to be hosting this session today, and Deloitte are our knowledge partner for today's webinar. As I say, it's a very pertinent topic. Many civil servants and public servants in the UK, and I'm sure lots of people who are watching this webinar agree on the need to build services around the user, but that goal can't be achieved if public bodies operate discrete standalone digital systems. There are huge opportunities to improve the efficiency, impact and accessibility of public services through both better coordination of digital transformation programs and in particular making better use of the public sector's vast data assets. But that can only be unlocked if public bodies work together, sharing data sets, using common platforms and integrating user journeys. Currently, doing so is limited both by legislation governing what data they can share, although we're going to find out in today's session how real those legislative barriers are, but also by organisational behaviours and practices, and by digital transformation schemes that do not cross departmental or agency boundaries. So how we can overcome these issues is what we're going to dig into in today's session, and there are obvious opportunities to be harnessed. We're also going to look at how the public sector's response to the coronavirus pandemic might have pointed a way forward. Data sharing was vital to the government's response in the pandemic, with different parts of the public sector sharing information on areas including how to provide food deliveries to clinically vulnerable people who were shielding, as well as the development of income support and business support schemes, and perhaps chief amongst them, monitoring the effectiveness of the government's lockdowns. So that was an unprecedented situation, of course, where the whole public sector was catalysed by a public health emergency. But we know from our work here at Global Government Forum that governments are looking now at how they can learn the lessons. How can they use what they found out about how to work quicker in the pandemic and apply it to their day-to-day work? And that, of course, includes issues around data and what we now know about the scope for governments to use data to provide better, more targeted services. And we have a great panel to discuss this topic, and I will introduce them in a moment. But before I do that, I also want to invite everybody who's watching to get involved and to provide any questions or thoughts to our panel. What are the data challenges that you face in your organisation? How has your organisation thought about tackling them? And what advice would you like from the panel who's joined us today to help solve your problems? Please get in touch using the Q&A function in Zoom throughout the session, and we will share as many of these questions with the panel when we can. And so, to the panel, let me introduce them. Firstly, we're joined by Ben Lyons, who is the Head of External Affairs and Insight at the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. The Centre leads the UK government's work to enable trustworthy innovation using data and AI, and Ben also worked as part of NHSX's response to COVID-19. And before joining government, he advised tech companies on public policy. Hello, Ben. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, Richard. Thanks very much. Good to be here.
We're also joined today by Pete Stokes, the Director of the Integrated Data Programme at the Office for National Statistics. The Integrated Data Programme is focused on improving the use of data from all parts of government, for example, linking together data from the National Health Service and administrative departments in government with the census to better inform government activity and policy. Pete has been at the ONS since 1998 And during COVID-19, he led work to make a range of relevant health data available through the secure research service at the ONS. So hello, Pete.
Hello, looking forward to the conversation. Great to be here.
We're also joined today by Lisa Allen, the Director of Data and Services at the Open Data Institute. Lisa is a data professional and has led many data teams in the UK public sector and has experience across various data disciplines, including open data, data protection, data transformation, and developing data strategy and frameworks. At the ODI, Lisa heads up the consultancy team who use their data expertise to advise companies, governments and organisations on how to make their data ecosystem work better for everyone. So hello, Lisa.
Yeah, great to be here.
And last but not least, we're joined by Nadun Muthakumarana, who is a data analytics partner from today's knowledge partner, Deloitte. Nadun has over 24 years experience in innovating and delivering complex data analytics and technology transformation to both national and global clients. At Deloitte, he is a lead partner for data analytics and artificial intelligence in the public and transformation sectors, and has developed industry scale AI solutions that are delivering gains in customer service delivery, operational planning, execution, and asset management. So hello, Nadun, thank you for joining too.
Thank you, Richard. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here.
So it's a great panel we've got to discuss this topic, and thanks to them all for joining today. Just again, a little reminder, please do submit any questions that you would like to put to them, and we have a section later in the session to put them to the panel. But I'm going to ask Ben to kick us off with some initial comments about how the public sector shares data. Ben.
Thanks, Richard, and it's really great to be here. We can go on to the next slide. And perhaps slide after this. Richard, as Richard mentioned, CDI are going to lead the UK's work on enabling trustworthy innovation and in data and AI. And I wanted to kind of focus today on the role of trust in enabling data sharing and trustworthiness. So in 2020, the CDI published a report on addressing trust in public sector data use. And we found that whilst there are, there are important barriers which are technical and legal, these are often well discussed, and where there are sometimes gaps in the discussion is the role of trust in public trust in data sharing. We found that there is a inconsistency in terms of the barriers that people experience, where the barriers to data sharing may be reinforced by relatively low public awareness of data sharing and absence of a really kind of developed understanding of public acceptability. And we found that this creates an environment which we termed an environment of tenuous trust, where I'll turn to it on the next slide, but where headline figures around public attitudes towards data sharing suggest reasonable levels of acceptance, but where this trust is potentially at risk in situations where the public are both unaware of the ways in which data sharing might be operating or become uncomfortable about it. And so we see an environment where there may be uncertainty among public servants about what types of data are considered acceptable by citizens, and then data holders themselves not necessarily being willing to share data, even in cases where there is a compelling public benefit. So if we can turn to the next slide, our public engagement work, and we've done quite a bit of it over the last year or two, suggests that people are generally comfortable with the idea of data being used by the public sector to bring benefits to the population. So more than half of people understand why personal information might be necessary for delivering services, compared to pretty low numbers who don't. And there is a sense also that the government is probably doing this. So I think there is a surprise we find through some of our qualitative engagement, so focus groups with the public, that the government doesn't just share lots of information behind the scenes, and people sometimes feel that they have given information to government and don't necessarily realize that there would be a difference between different departments or data holders within government, and the fact that information might not be shared. However, this point around tenuous trust, I think, is an important one, because we, whilst there is that baseline acceptability, people have very low understanding of how data sharing operates in practice. Relatively low numbers believing that the best use is being made of their data. We find from our research that people who become more aware of how their data is being used do tend to increase their level of comfort with government data use tends to increase with that greater understanding and knowledge. So I think that is positive, that with greater understanding, it does actually lead to greater levels of trust. But I think this suggests a need for high levels of public engagement, both through understanding the and particularly in higher profile or higher importance data sharing projects, understanding public concerns and working to meet them, and also explaining to the public the way in which their data is being used. And we tend to think about this, that, you know, in terms of trust in data sharing at a number of different levels and a number of different areas that need to be explored. So, you know, firstly, public underlying confidence in the institutions within government that are sharing their data is important, and how data sharing is understood by the public will be related to their underlying attitudes towards whether or not they trust both that institution and their intent in terms of the way in which their data is being used. Linked to this, a really clear purpose for the data use is important, and enabling the public to understand that why their data is being used and the benefit that will have. Clarity on the mechanisms that are kind of keeping them safe, so both keeping data secure but also accountable and transparent, and providing reassurance about how personal information is being protected is also important. So I'll turn to the final slide, which is sets out a few thoughts on ways of embedding kind of good governance and technical approaches in data sharing, and some of the stuff that we're working on at the moment at the CDI. So first, in the context of good governance, we are exploring a number of approaches to help partners on the ground to deliver data sharing projects in a way that commands public trust and earns the trust of the public. So we have, for example, been working with the Department for Education and around a big piece of work around children's social care, and the you know, this being kind of a key area where data can be used effectively to improve the provision of services to vulnerable children, but where there is a real need to ensure that there is robust governance in place in order to ensure that the issues like data recording, data quality, and really engaging with care experienced communities is being brought into the governance for this data sharing work. And we are at the moment establishing pilots with local authorities to apply guidance and unlock common data sharing challenges in local government. And we're looking to publish this guidance in draft form in the coming months. So I think that's an example of some of the work we're doing, which is kind of hands-on and on the ground in terms of data sharing challenges, but also we're doing work to explore the role of data intermediaries. So these are, models for data stewardship, which can help to kind of absorb some of the costs and risks associated with data sharing. And I know the ODI do a lot of work in this space too, and perhaps we can talk about this more when we come to questions. Finally, I just wanted to touch on some of the technical approaches and emerging technical approaches that are developing, which can, I think, also enable more trustworthy data sharing and have the potential to do so. So privacy enhanced technologies, I think, are a really interesting development, which are a set of new technologies which enable personal data to be accessed and shared, but in ways which protect privacy. And we've been doing work at the CDI both through a adoption guide for privacy enhancing technology, so enabling organizations to think through what these different technologies look like and how they might enable data sharing. And we're also doing work with the United States government at the moment through a prize challenge that we'll be launching in the coming months to help to drive greater adoption of privacy enhanced technologies, which we see as potentially a kind of a body of tools which will enable forms of data sharing which can't currently take place because of data protection or other challenges which might make it hard to share data at the moment. But we're really interested in exploring the ways in which pets might be able to enable greater trustworthy data sharing. So I'll wrap up there, but really keen to take questions when we get to it.
Great, thank you very much, Ben. That's really interesting, particularly the point around people's getting more comfortable with the data sharing that's happening in government, the more they know about it, and that existing simultaneously with the idea that government perhaps is doing more of this than it currently is. I think the case for that kind of public engagement that you're talking about there is really well made. I think we might touch on that in the questions, because that sounds like it presents an opportunity, I guess, for the public sector. Moving on to Pete now to hear about how the ONS is working on cross public sector data sharing and perhaps some of the work in the pandemic. Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, and thanks also to Ben for unknowingly doing a presentation which so beautifully tees up a lot of what I'm about to say and gives some really good context. So yeah, as you said at the beginning, I've worked for ONS since 1998, which means last year I hit the dubious milestone of having worked for ONS for more than half my life, which is quite a scary thought. But since 2014, I've led for ONS in finding a way to make more of our data available, opening up ONS data for wider research use. And I don't mean the kind of published tabular data, which have always been accessible, but the record level microdata. How can you make those raw data available so you can get more benefit from those, so that every time anyone fills in one of our surveys or fills in the census, that actually those data are used for more than just the initial published statistics? How do we sweat the asset better, get best value? And so the way we've done that, and the reason we do that is because the more use that is made of the data, the better decisions can be made and informed by data. And until recently, the ONS strategy was called Better Statistics, Better Decisions. It fits with that. But in the context of this forum, if you make better use of data, you get better decision making as well as that, which means you deliver better services across government, which means everybody wins. And that's the principle. But as Ben was saying, trust is key. We can't, however, whatever value comes from data, doesn't mean we can just have a free-for-all, a buffet. Everyone can come and use whatever data they like. There have to be controls. You have to find a way of doing it securely. You have to find a way of protecting confidentiality. And the way we have done that historically is I run what is called the Secure Research Service, which Richard mentioned in the intro, which is it's a secure environment where data is stored, and we govern it through what we call a 5 safes framework. And they're often called trusted research environments these days. But what that means is that we have these microdata in a secure environment. People can come and use those data, but to use those data, we have to vet and accredit and train the people who will use those data to make sure that they're competent to use data and can be trusted. We only let data be used for research projects that are explicitly in the public interest. The data are held in a secure environment, and which means that although the analyst doesn't have to come to us to use the data, when they log on, they effectively log on all the processing, all the data stay on our servers. The research has a virtual window, if you like it, into our environment through the processing, but we remain in control. We also check all of the outputs that are produced from an analyst. So any analysis that's done using these record level data are then assessed by my team to make sure that there is no risk to confidentiality as a result, and no inappropriate use of the data. And then finally, although we allow use of record level data, we do provide some protection to the data. We remove direct identifiers so that you don't accidentally see your next door neighbor's record in the data when you're using it and learn something about them you shouldn't. So that's the concept that we've been running in the SRS for a while. And some of the key principles there is that, that any research that happens using microdata delivery service that we provide clearly and explicitly must serve the public good. It has to be in the public interest. The people whose data are being used, the general public, must benefit from that research. And we have an independent panel that assesses all would-be uses of the data. And then the other principle is that it's all going to be transparent. If you're going to come and use data that belongs to the public, we're going to put your name on a website and say, look, these researchers are using your data. This is what they're doing with it. When they've finished, the results are going to be published. You can go here and see what they've done with it. You can see the value to try and build some of that confidence that the data are being used properly, and to raise awareness of what's being done, really. And what I do now is, and what ONS are doing now, is trying to take that concept and take it up, well, more than a level, take it up several levels, really. So I lead the program which is building what we're calling an integrated data service, which is trying to say, actually, how can we take not just ONS's data, how can we take data from right across government? How do we make those data more easily accessible? How do we make them accessible to analysts across government departments? Because I suspect when we'll talk later on about the difficulties of within government data sharing, never mind data sharing outside of government, but that's fiendishly difficult. How can we make that better? How can we build a service that makes it easier for an analyst in DWP to use data from DFE and vice versa without the time that takes? And then how can we make those data more widely available? How can we do that in a way that maintains that public trust? And then the last thing I will just talk about is, and one of the reasons we want to do that is that however much value comes from a source of data, however much value there is in using some of ONS's data, whether it's our labour force survey data, our registration data, our census data, those benefits are multiplied if you're able to link sources together. If you can combine different data sources from different parts of government, there is huge value to be gained, a huge benefit to society that comes from being able to do so. And so the last thing I was just going to talk about was to give an example, a real world example of where we demonstrated that, really, and a good example, so which I think, Ben was talking, people don't always see they benefit from the use of their data, or data aren't always used appropriately. An example of really where it was from the last couple of years. So during the pandemic, obviously the NHS were working hugely hard, and in the process of responding to the pandemic, were collecting a lot of really useful data. They know who had COVID in the country. They know who had COVID. They know how severely they had COVID. They know who died. And alongside that, they also collected some supplementary information, which meant early on in COVID, a lot of people might have seen stories saying, actually, people from ethnic minorities appeared to be suffering from COVID more frequently and more severely than white British people. I mean, that was clear and evident in the statistics they're producing. What they couldn't tell was why. And that's really important, because if you don't know why, you don't know whether actually there is some sort of genetic root cause of that, or whether there are other factors in play. So we in ONS then worked really closely with NHS Digital to say, actually, we need more data. We need more data to understand the problem there. So we took those data that the NHS had, we linked them to census data that we hold from 2011, which meant that not only could we complete the ethnicity data, so you get a fuller picture because we have ethnicity data for everybody in the country, but we could look beyond that. We could say, actually, in addition to knowing people's ethnicity, we know what jobs people do. And we know their household living structures, which means you can look beyond the simplistic simplistic correlation and look for a more causal relationship. And actually, then you can see that people in some minority groups are more likely, for example, to live in multi-generational households. People who live in multi-generational households were therefore more likely to have children catching COVID or working adults catching COVID, bringing it home and then transmitting it to old parents and grandparents who lived with them, who were then more susceptible to more serious illness, and that explains a lot of the difference we've seen. People in some ethnic groups may be more likely to work and demonstrably more likely to work in public-facing roles in cities, for example, therefore more likely to be exposed, or more likely to work in the health service and therefore more likely to be exposed to higher viral load. So being able to understand that help directly inform the government response and understand the genuine causes of the differences we were seeing. That was really useful. But then actually, when the vaccine rollout started last year, we were able to bring those data in. We could then say, with these linked data that we had together, we could say, actually, what were vaccine uptake rates like by people in different parts of the country, by people in different communities, of people in different socioeconomic groups, which was really useful and directly useful to informing central and local government response in targeting people to take up the vaccine, not targeting individuals, but targeting communities, targeting geographic areas where there was low uptake. And further than that, we could then say, after everyone had their first vaccine and the second vaccine was being actually offered and the booster was being offered, we could directly show the drop-off rates and the difference in drop-off rates between different communities where there's greater or lesser skepticism of government saying, you need to go and get this jab, it'll be good for you. So again, being able to directly inform government, the government, where government effort was in trying to further encouragement, and the results of that are there to see in the huge uptake of the vaccine across the country. And although a lot of that comes from that general public goodwill and people wanting to do the right thing and people wanting to be able to live their lives, the way government was able to manage it was directly data driven, and data driven by secure and robust and appropriate linkage and use of data from across the public sector. So that's all I was going to say as way of some opening thoughts, but I'm really looking forward to the questions and discussion afterwards.
Great, thanks very much, Pete. That's really interesting. And I think the examples you shared there of how the data was brought together as part of the COVID response is a really interesting example of what can be done, and quite a good one for us to dig into, as you say, in the discussion, to see if that is something that could be applied in different different policy areas, perhaps. Next, we're going to hear from Lisa at the Open Data Institute to get her perspective on these issues. Lisa.
Hey all, it's great to be here. So yeah, thanks for my introduction, Richard. So for me, I've worked most of my career actually in government. So I was part of the release of the 2000 data sets as open, the Environment Agency in 2015, which pushed the UK up into the top 10 for open data maturity in the world. And I also worked at Ordnance Survey and DEFRA, so where I led data initiatives to make data easy to find, both by the public and by the private sector. And here at the ODI, I'm helping organisations like Ofwat and the Met Police with their open data journeys. So today I'm going to come up from slightly different angles, and it does cover actually some of the stuff that Pete and Ben have also discussed, and so it links nicely. So I'm going to talk to you about the value of data as an intangible asset, thinking about the benefits of sharing data and how sharing can lead to trust, some of those barriers that you face and how to overcome these, and think about the private data for public good, and actually the pandemic is a bit of an example of that. So for those of you who don't know the ODI, we're the Open Data Institute, and we're set up 10 years ago now by Tim Berners-Lee and Sir Nigel Shadbolt. So we're a not-for-profit organisation, and we really want a world where data works for everyone. So this is why we work with the private and the public sector to help build that open and trustworthy data ecosystems. So let's start by thinking about the value of data as an intangible asset. So first of all, if you think about data and intellectual property, they're both intangible assets. And I think it's quite surprising when you see that the top 5 companies in the world have intangible assets now worth 81% of their overall value. It won't surprise you to know they include the likes of Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, and Alphabet, which obviously includes Google and Facebook. So I think this really shows the world is changing. The companies that are doing well understand the value of their data assets, and it's just not the value to themselves, but to the wider society. And this is why it's really important for government. And this trend has been picked up by Treasury, and you can find blogs from them on their knowledge, economy, and innovation in the UK public sector. And they flagged that 15 years ago, the largest companies would have had physical assets like their factories, their oil reserves, and their building being their most valuable assets. So by contrast, today, with that overall value coming from these leading organisations being their IP, their R&D, their know-how, their data, that intangible assets, it just shows how important data is and how it's come up very quickly in the world and how important it is. So let's think about the benefits of sharing data and how sharing can lead to trust. But you start off by thinking, well, the benefit for who? So for businesses, the ODI did a survey for British businesses on how they share data. And we all know that competitive markets and supply chains require businesses to share data to drive innovation and create efficiencies. But in the survey we did in 2020, it showed that only 27% of businesses answered yes when asked if they share any of their data with other organisations or individuals. But 50% of them all agreed that increased access to data would help their businesses grow. So for businesses to grow, they need to share more. So what does it mean for government? So there's various areas that can help government. So first of all, by sharing data, it can lead to transparency. And we've already touched on a bit of that already, which can lead to public trust when we're open with that government data. It can lead to public service improvements. So if you think of the likes of Department for Transport sharing the data on the transport networks, so it's been integrated in things like City Mapper. That not only benefits the citizens, but it also benefits the data provider in that case, because they're able to analyse the data, predict when the busiest times are, and the services that need to be built upon that. It can also lead to innovation, and which can lead to economic value. So when I did the open data work at the Environment Agency, when we released that data, it led to that data being picked up in things like Minecraft, stuff we would never have guessed it would have been used in actually. And I think that just shows that you're not always the best to anticipate how your data is going to be used once it's shared. And then it can lead to efficiencies. So sharing data gives that exposure. It can improve the quality of the data and the decisions that can be made on top of it. And I think it's not just about sharing that data with other departments or externally. It actually goes to sharing it within your own organisation. I think for government, when we did this years ago, I managed to save £10 million a year just by sharing the data related to our IT costs and services, which had never been exposed in that way before. So for me, it's not just sharing externally to other organisations, but actually having that whole culture of sharing internally too. So what are the barriers faced and how to overcome these? And I'm not going to be able to cover them all in the depth needed because there's lots, but you can cut them in a number of ways, but I've cut them today by thinking about the data. So you might not know what data you have or how to find it, or does everybody use a different format so it makes it really hard to share, or are there quality issues actually that makes you worried about sharing it? Some of the ways to overcome these are through obviously just basic data management techniques like data cataloging, using data standards, but it really depends on the issues. The next one that faces a lot in government is technology. The data may be locked up in old systems. It may be hard to get out and share. So there's no overcoming really that investment in IT and making sure that you are keeping up. Then you've got the issues with policies and processes. You might not know how to share the data or who signs it off, or you might be worried about the various things that can stop you from sharing, like commercial IP, not considering the ethical impact or personal data issues. So at the ODI, we've created a data sharing risk assessment to help people to consider things before sharing data. And then you can look at how to mitigate those things and then share it. But we've got a guide for you, and I can share it in the chat as well, but we've put it on the website so you can see that as well. So it's available for you to use. And then it might be issues with people, because the people may not have the skills to know about the data management fundamentals. They might not be able to catalog it, or they might not understand the risks. So this goes back down to data literacy or basic data skills. And then the big one that can get in the way really is the culture. So this can stop people sharing data widely, because actually people may not see the benefits to change. And people may not realise that data will be beneficial to others, like our Environment Agency data being used in Minecraft. And we're not always the best at understanding how others will use it. But for the trust and confidence purposes, it's important to understand that not all data can be shared. So data does appear on a spectrum from closed to open. And we've got the open data, the ODI data spectrum. And that sets out, because some of the things on the closed, like national security or personal data, will mean that prevent you from sharing. So for that trust purposes, it's important to understand there's a continuum. So how does private data help with public good? We heard a little bit about this during the pandemic. And so I don't think for me, you can look at just government data in isolation. During the pandemic, data was shared across the public and private sector. And it was really used to look at public policy to see if it was working, the impact on the high streets. It was used for so many more, and we've covered some of those today. But data is needed from those different sectors, from those different topics. And I think that just shows that it's really important when we're tackling things like climate change, considering data sharing across different sectors. But during the pandemic, really saw the barriers to data sharing being swept away, really, because the need to help people was greater, and it took away some of those cultural barriers, and it really broke those down. So there was definitely it was a great thing to come around an issue, but I think it does really highlight, because there were still issues of things like not being able to find the data and things like that, or who had that data. But it highlights the importance of those firm foundations. So in summary, I think data is more powerful when it's combined. So sharing data allows that data to flow around that ecosystem, and that can be amplified, and that can lead to better knowledge, insight, better decisions for society, the environment, and the economy.
Fascinating, Lisa. Thank you very much for that. Setting out those barriers to data sharing is excellent jumping off point for the rest of this conversation. I want to dig into some of those when we get to the questions, because that's really interesting to kind of hear them broken down like that. Yes, we'll try and explore some of those shortly. Before we do that though and get into the questions, and again, just a little reminder, if you're watching along and would like to submit a question to the panel, please use the Q&A function, and we'll get to questions very shortly. Before we do so though, I want to ask Nadun to make his comments on data sharing in the public sector. Hello, Nadun.
Thank you, Richard. Hi, everyone. So you heard a few aspects of data sharing in public sector from my fellow panelists. What I wanted to, over and above what you just heard, what I wanted to sort of highlight are a few observations in the evolution of data sharing in the public sector that we have made, and I have made, especially over the last 2 years during the pandemic years, and the impact, both positive and negative, it has had on data sharing. So what I wanted to do is to just take a closer look at the nature of the data that we have across public sector being shared historically, and how is it evolving, and where is it heading. So data sharing has happened in various sort of guises for a long time in public sector, and it was important that it was done in order to help improve and continue citizen services or public services, as well as it has been important. I think the pandemic, sort of out of necessity, in order to respond as public services to the pandemic, we think hugely sort of drove the need to share more and more data across public sector organizations. That was easy to see, but the interesting thing was around the nature of the type of data that was being needed to be shared compared to the historic type of data. So historically, a lot of, and this continues to happen, but historically, before the pandemic, most of the data that was shared across public sector organizations has been what we call long and narrow data. So long in the sense that the time, the amount of data that goes back a number of years being long, and the data that is being shared is mainly confined to that particular organization that generates data within the walls of that organization. So we call it long and narrow. When the pandemic happened and public services organizations needing to rapidly make decisions in order to respond to the pandemic, the kind of data that those organizations needed and to acquire and to share from other organizations, both interestingly, not only public sector organizations, but private sector organizations that are within your what we call value chain, but in reality relevant to the kind of services that, or adjacent to the type of services that those organizations deliver, were interesting in the sense that it needed to be much more near real time in order to understand a specific dynamic situation that's happening in a particular area or a particular group of people. You needed what we call short-term data. It could be a few days old, it could be a few weeks old, but certainly wasn't needing to go back 3 years or 5 years or anything else like that. So short data, but the second aspect of it being wide. So we say short and wide being not only just data created by your own organization, but data collected and shared across your value chains, both across public sector and private sector. So given the nature of this, dynamic, short and wide across your value chain type of data, in order to explain this new pattern and new nature of the data, we coined this term called effervescent data. Effervescent being data that keep changing, or information that keeps changing all of the time, but spread across a wide area of a network. So the sharing of effervescent data, I think, is a really new added a new dynamic to public sector across public sector data sharing, and I think it's a very positive addition to the nature of the data that's now being shared. Now the key question and what we are eagerly sort of observing is, now that we are kind of coming out of the pandemic and the dynamic nature of the way you need to respond to various situations, and the decision-making process is less, will that type of data sharing slow down or stop? So hopefully a lot of the organizations who started to share these type of data, as well as the historic long and narrow data, will continue, both types of data being shared across public sector and with some adjacent private sector organizations, will hopefully will continue to create that rich set of data that on one hand allows public sector service delivery organizations to make those type of dynamic decisions in order to respond to dynamic sort of situations in both in the citizens or geographically or in value or supply chains, but also the long and narrow data being combined to develop more analysis, trend analysis, and historical type of analysis to develop and enhance better policies. So that's kind of an interesting observation. Hopefully all of you would have seen, and if you look closely, be able to identify those sort of patterns in the nature of the data that's being shared. The second aspect of data sharing I wanted to highlight is, and some of my colleagues on the panel did cover some of it, is the ongoing, and I work with lots of chief data officers and related individuals in public sector organizations in sharing data. The ongoing and the evolving conversation is around some of the topics we already mentioned, like security, how do you manage privacy, and both legislation and the mindsets and the behaviors are continuing to improve, and therefore enabling the sharing of data, including personal information of citizens. But the public trust, I think Ben talked about, still is needs to go a long way, and there's a gap between the organization sharing and genuinely trying to improve services, but the communication of it into the public in order to build trust. But one aspect that I want to add to a lot of the stuff that's been already discussed is the usage of that data. So having talked to you about the temporal nature of the data, the dynamic and the effervescent type versus the more historical and static type, when you share data, the evolution of the conversation and the thinking across public sector data professionals is around the usage. So I think it's well rehearsed in the way you acquire loads of long and narrow or historical data sets, put it into on a platform or a big data warehouse, and being able to query and do pattern identify patterns or do research. But there is a evolving sort of a learning curve around how do you not only share but preserve the accuracy of the data as it changes all the time. So if you just fire and forget or share and forget a set of data, and somebody's going to use it 2 weeks down the line, but the actual information, the data changes, will that analysis, based on the nature of the usage of that data, it might not be valid anymore. So a lot of professionals in public sector as well as private sector are now trying to figure out what is the best practice and best ways, using latest technology tools and sort of connectivity methods to see how you can keep the data up to date as it changes all the time, and yet get the benefits of being able to share it with other organizations and collectively to use them to deliver public services. So that's the second sort of observation around the evolution of the sharing. Last but not least, I think Lisa probably talked a little bit about it, is what we call is about datanomics. So this is the economics of the data sharing across public sector. So a lot of organizations, as individual organizations, as they go through their spending reviews, annual budgeting processes, have been generous and determined about investing funds to do data sharing, which does cost a lot, not only to curate your data, but the sharing of it does take effort and money. But then if you look at across public sector and talk to a lot of the chief data officers and other relevant organizations, I think there is a growing sentiment across these professionals or organizations to sort of create a cross public sector business case, not only a business case, but develop the sentiment where there is a central source of funding to improve this cross-sector type of sharing, as well as the individuals, organizations being able to do the funding at source. So datanomics, how do you articulate this in a standardized sort of a common way across different organizations across public sector is a hot topic. But the good news is from what I've seen, all of the key data leaders are having conversations, sharing information, sharing ideas around how to create a common language about the, to articulate the benefits and the need to share data, and through that to create off the back of the things that are already happening, like the National Data Strategy and various other cross-public sector initiatives, to create that level of an awareness of the economics of doing it as well, in order to improve that even further. So hopefully that gives you three additional sort of aspects of data sharing across public sector. I'll stop for now and happy to answer questions as we get to it.
Thanks very much, Nadoon. I love that idea of effervescent data. That is a phrase that has stuck in my head since you mentioned it to me in our little prep call for this session. I think it really catalyzes the kind of possibilities we're talking about here of kind of, quick availability of information to inform public services. We're going to move to the questions now. Some people are submitting questions already that have been answered by some of our panelists very helpfully on the Zoom chat function, but please do submit more and we'll get to as many as we can. I want to start by asking Pete, if I can, about the examples that you mentioned, Pete, of the how the ONS used data around COVID and the kind of the differences in terms of ethnicity and infection rates earlier in the pandemic, and that information being married together. In terms of looking at how this might be done kind of across public services, because you can imagine, an approach like that being applied in other areas, did that have to overcome any specific barriers, or did that feel like it was kind of something different or exceptional at the time that it was done? How would you say the lessons have flowed from that kind of initiative?
Yeah, thank you. It wasn't easy to do. That is the reality. Even in a time of crisis, it wasn't easy to get agreement to link those data together, to work out where they would happen, to agree a legal basis for it to happen, because for the sharing of record level data, particularly identifiable data that can be linked, you need a really strong sound legal basis. It was really challenging to do that. Now, what the pandemic gave us was that clear sense of urgency that find a way, there must be a way, which was hugely useful, and we were able to do it. If we hadn't had that, we probably would still be trying to link the data now, is the reality. And in part of that is because there is when we look legally at how to share data, there's a distinct difference between health data and other data held in the public sector in terms of the legal gateways that can be used to do that. And we have to use a combination. But linking those data is hard without that push. Now, the lessons we've learned from it are actually the value that comes from when you do it, actually that it is possible to link these large sensitive data sets together in a way that not only delivers clear public benefits, because that was pretty inarguable, I think, but in a way that hasn't cost us public trust, which is key to everything we do. I mean, not just in ONS, all departments who hold data, public trust is important, and that is one of the reasons people are so cautious about sharing data is not wanting to lose that trust. But for ONS, public trust is core to everything we do. If we don't have that, nobody will fill in our surveys, our censuses, and we might as well shut up shop and go home. So it's critical to us. We've shown we've been able to do this without sharing public trust, and I hope that what the lesson that's learned from it is actually it is possible to do it. We've shown we can do it in a time of crisis. Now let's show we can do it in a time where we're not in crisis. Let's see which data sets we can link together, which will inform the government's levelling up agenda, which will need to be data driven. You can't level up the country if you don't know which level each part is at. You need to have those metrics together. You need the intelligence to drive the policy, to drive the investment. Let's see what data sets we can do to respond to that. Let's look at what data we can link together to better understand the changing kind of trading relationship with the UK. Let's look at the health data that we've linked together. Essentially, what else can we link into that will help us answer the next health crisis? What else can we use those data for? So those are the lessons that we learned. But yeah, not easy thing to do, and we're all still finding our way in doing it. I think is the honest answer.
Mm-hmm. And just before I bring in the rest of the panel, I mean, Lisa set out the kind of obstacles very nicely, I thought, and you mentioned legal there. Kind of as you look across the piece, is the legal basis for doing this kind of top thing that stops it happening?
From my perspective, I mean, it's the most cited reason, but there are usually legal ways to share data, provided you can demonstrate there is value in doing so. There are more cultural barriers, I think, and those cultural barriers exist for good reason, because every public body that holds data on the general public has collected those data on the express condition that they will keep them secure, keep them confidential, they will look after them and use them appropriately. So we all make that commitment when we bring data in, but that then drives a reluctance to share data, because if something bad were to happen, you would be breaching that trust. And it's those cultural barriers and that cultural caution, and I would argue over caution, that is the biggest blocker. And the only way really to unblock that, I think, and this is what we're trying to do, is to show that it can be done without the sky falling in. And that's why we've pushed so hard in ONS to open up all of our data for research in a safe and secure way. It's not a free-for-all, as I said, but the more we can do with our data, the more we can demonstrate to other public bodies that actually this is a reasonable thing to do. And the longer we've done it, the more other departments have dipped a toe in the water and tried the same as well. The more internationally you see other countries doing it, but it's those cultural barriers more than the legislation, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we've got a couple of additional questions from the audience on that issue, Pete. I'll just put those to you quickly. About kind of one from Charlie Houghton here that says, sounds like it's repurposing data for a different purpose than it was collected for. Is that something that provided a kind of legal challenge? And was there issues around consent? And then perhaps maybe to bring Ben in on that, because I thought Ben was really
a really good question, actually. Any data that are collected by ONS, we do explicitly state when we collect that those data will be used for the production of statistics, but also for research purposes. We're explicit when we make that point. In terms of, but supplementary to that, a lot of legal gateways exist that enable the reuse of data for statistical research, for the production of statistics, production of analysis that are of value, without explicitly needing consent. And the reason for that isn't, I mean, in part because collecting consent is a long process, but if you make everything conditional on data subject consent, then you end up with some of the problems that have been seen when the NHS tried to refresh their collection of GP data and the reuse of those data, is that if you have lots of people opting out and not giving their consent, you make the data less useful, because people don't opt out as an even cross-section of society. Particular subsets of the population are more or less skeptical of data sharing, more or less likely to consent to their data being available. People who are more aware of the discussion are more likely then to opt out and not give consent if you do it that way. So consent isn't always essential in enabling research, provided the research is clearly covered under one of the legal gateways that government has created to enable the use of research, and provided that no use is made of the data about an individual. We wouldn't use your data about Richard Johnson to learn about you. We would use your data as part of a set of millions of records that help us understand patterns in society, look at those data, produce aggregate statistics, which then can directly inform policy and services.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question from Susan Fleming that I'll put to Ben in the first instance. Susan says she's uncomfortable with the emergency COVID data sharing measures being retained post-COVID. I'm not sure the public see benefits and worry about excessive state surveillance. What does confidentiality mean now? I mean, to put that to you, Ben, and jump off the point that you made in your opening remarks, do you think that has there been any change in public attitudes post-COVID from the kind of data sharing that we're talking about, and kind of the options that kind of flow from that?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, we did a big survey a couple of months ago, which was a 4,000 person survey, and we're kind of looking to run it as a tracker survey into public attitudes towards data and AI. And one of the questions that we asked was, where do people remember reading something positive about the use of data? And it was a kind of free text box type response. And you can kind of see the kind of word cloud in this report, which I'll link to in a second, but you just have a very, very big COVID-19 coming up as the response. So I mean, that and some of our kind of qualitative work, you know, suggests to me that people did see a benefit to the use of data in tackling the pandemic, but you know, and there are, you know, a range of examples where data sharing operated in a way that would have been really challenging before the pandemic, and where there was real public benefit. But clearly, you know, there is a need to ensure that as we move out of the kind of, you know, the kind of immediate emergency response pandemic, that we share data in a way that is trustworthy and responsible, and is setting an expectation that data can and should be used for the public benefit, but that needs to be done in the right way. And I think that you know, to Pete's point, I thought, you know, kind of interesting that that often some of the legal barriers were able to be worked through, but that it took a great deal of kind of institutional will potentially to do so, which might not have been the case, you know, were it not for the pandemic. So there's a need both to kind of develop these kind of pathfinder projects and work which, you know, which provide really useful case studies for how people can see, you know, how you use data in a way that is both effective and really well managed, but also thinking through, like, you know, what is the guidance, and what is the kind of better understanding, so that people can know how to do it right. And I think, you know, often we see you know, in terms of some of the risks, perhaps a perceived legal risk as much as the legal risk itself. And so having that guidance to know how to manage data sharing projects legally, I think is really important. I guess the other point I'd make, you know, coming back to this point about consent, is that I would agree with what Pete said about the risks of patchy data and what that means for equity and other issues in terms of potential bias in data sets, if, you know, if there is limited data. But I think that there's probably ways of thinking through what are other models for enabling citizens' interests to be reflected in the way that data is governed. So you know, as I mentioned, we've been doing work kind of exploring the role of data intermediaries. So this is like, this is a term which is a kind of bucket term for data trusts, for data cooperatives, data exchanges, but essentially kind of these different mechanisms which can be established to steward data and potentially act in a way that manages different parties' competing interests, and including in that the role of the citizen. So it's not necessarily, I think the relationship doesn't need to be purely just the citizen and government, but I think we should be exploring what is the role of third parties which can represent citizen interests, but without imposing that in every case the kind of the cognitive burden on the citizen of having to determine how how their data might be used in every single case.
Nadine, you wanted to come in and make a point after that?
Yeah, just a quick one. But so we all, a lot of the stuff that was just mentioned was all from the perspective of the data collectors and the users, the public sector organizations. But I think it's really important that we also focus on in the context of the public trust around the public themselves, or citizens as we all are. There are well-known studies around how, as a citizen, we share lots of personal data with private sector global organizations with less skepticism compared to the kind of concerns that an average citizen has in sharing data with the government or public sector organization, and especially cross public sector data sharing. So I think one aspect that is probably not focused on enough just yet is to communicate, so citizens hear all of the negative stories of things having gone wrong, or the misuse of public data by public sector organizations, which happens very rarely, but they get to hear about it. But I think that there isn't enough communications to educate. It's an ongoing and a long-term process, but in order to change hearts and minds, you have to explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, and explain the benefits that they're getting. They get the genuine benefits of these services you enhance through data sharing, but never explain to them in a coherent way. So I think that needs to be enhanced if you were to get or increase the level of public trust.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, you mentioned the six, I think it was six, kind of pillars or areas that cause barriers to data sharing. I wondered if you had any thoughts on whether the balance between those had shifted following the pandemic. Have people realized that perhaps some of those barriers are more overcomable, for want of a better word, than others, or is the kind of situation broadly as it was 3 or 4 years ago?
I think it depends on the maturity of the organisation. So some organisations are more mature. I mean, if you look at ONS and the stuff that Pete's doing, they've got their data fundamentals nailed. But for other government departments, it won't be the case. So I think some of them will be starting the basics. They might not even have a data catalogue and know the data they've got, let alone to be able to share it. So I think it really depends on the maturity of those organisations. I think what's probably getting more exposure and what's shifting more is talking about some of those barriers to sharing. So, Pete said about the legal barriers being the one that people tend to focus on, but there are other ones like ethics is really coming up at the moment. That the bias that's collected in the data accidentally, and then when it's shared, the repercussions. So I think some of those things are turning on the head, because I think it's about understanding the data you're going to share, but to share it, you really need to understand those before you collect it. So you can collect it in the right way, and you're considering all those sorts of things. So I mean, back when I was sharing data, those 2,000 data sets as open, I just remember the barriers that people put up, because normally it was about culture and it was about fear. They would say it was because of people wouldn't understand my data, or no, there's legal reasons, but actually it normally came back to the fear. Most of the time you can look through all the different aspects and you could mitigate them. Obviously with some of the data, national security, personal data that on a spectrum, that they don't go out. But the others, you could mitigate against some of those risks, and other data should just be designed to be opened. So I think it's about really understanding when those barriers are real and they're not. I think technology for the public sector has obviously been a big thing and a problem, and it's been working through that because it is expensive to get the right tech. But as far as the people skills, they're definitely improving since the pandemic, I think, because everybody talks about data now, which is brilliant. So there's definitely a move, and we did some research. I can put it in about the government's skills in data. I'll put it in the chat so everybody can see some research we did recently on that too.
Excellent, thank you very much. That'd be great. I think we're coming towards the end of the session, so I just want to get some closing comments from everybody, and just to highlight one of the questions from Ingrid Stone, who was, how are you capturing and sharing lessons learned? So if as I go around the panel for closing comments, anybody has a way that they can direct Ingrid to, or links that they can share in the chat, as I know people have been doing already, that would be excellent. So yeah, just final thoughts. I was going to ask you all for kind of your advice, really, if for the public servants that are watching this, what would you say to them that they can do to improve data sharing? What would your top tip be, just to finish the session? I'll start with Pete because he's in the top left-hand corner as I look.
What can they do to improve data sharing? I think first of all, start from a position of assuming that it's possible. Because we quite often assume that it isn't. Start from the position of assuming that it's possible. If you have challenges, reach out to those of us that have shown that it's possible, because we want to help. The more we can make best use of data held across the public sector, the better. But when you're looking to make it available, remember that you have to do it in a way that is not only within the bounds of the legislation, but is within the bounds of public acceptability as well. It's really key. You have to do things in a way that looks like it is in the public interest, as well as being in the public interest.
Lisa, do you want to share any tips and closing comments?
Yeah, I think it's don't be restricted by the way that you use the data today and think that people are not interested. I think it's amazing what people can do with that data that you have, that you just use for something you think quite mundane. So yeah, just don't be bound by your own organizational use of that data.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think there's lots of examples in COVID where data was collected for reasons that were unrelated to, or hadn't been envisioned when it was collected. Really interesting. Ben, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think act in a way that builds trust. So, be clear to people about why you're sharing data. Think, not just, how you might explain it, in a meeting, with a colleague, but also, think how would you explain it to a family member in terms of what is the purpose of your data sharing. Think about like what is the governance that you're, and particularly if it feels like something that might be higher risk, think about what is the governance that you're doing that keeps people safe and their interests protected. So that's not just thinking about what does legal compliance look like, although obviously that's really important, but it's also thinking through like, are you thinking through wide-ranging, engagement with groups of people who might be affected by the program? Are you ensuring that you're giving citizens some route to influence the approach you're taking, if that feels right for the program that you're doing, and be transparent about why you're doing it and how you're doing it. And I guess also I'd just say that, that we work to help teams in the public sector to build trustworthy governance in terms of their data sharing projects, and we'd be happy to speak to you.
Excellent, thanks very much. I like that, the data equivalent of the old journalist maxim that you write the story like you're explaining it to a friend down the pub. Think in those terms. Nadoon, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think, in order to continue to enhance and improve public sector services, data sharing will be not only critical, it's essential. So it will go on and it will evolve. My kind of advice or sort of guidance to professionals in the public sector will be, in the past, it's most of the data sharing has been sort of bilateral type of sharing between two organizations. But the future is sort of a multilateral, it's emerging, but to develop ways of sharing data at the same time and to be consumed across a network rather than just between two organizations. So how can we drive public sector data sharing to that sort of a level? And then I'm not going to say any more, but be absolutely transparent and tell citizens exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Excellent, excellent. Good tips all. Thank you very much. And that's where I'm going to have to bring our session to a close. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much to our panel for joining us today and for everybody for watching along. We want to keep the conversation going, so you will receive a recording of this session when it is available in the next few days, and also a report on the session in the next couple of weeks. And I will make sure that report includes all the links and information that we have been discussing today. Before that, though, there'll be a survey in your inbox now to get your thoughts on today's session, and it would really help me and the team here at Global Government Forum. If you were able to complete that, that helps us make sure we're providing the best content for you all. And any ideas on topics you would like us to cover in future webinars would also be welcome. That would make my life a lot easier. I also just want to flag, this is the first in a series of webinars on cross-public sector collaboration that Global Government Forum is running. The next, which you can see advertised on the slide now, is early intervention, how the public sector can work together to unlock prevention, on the 23rd of June. And we also have webinars planned on the Public Sector Workforce Challenge, making shared services work, and the future of the office in the public sector. So there's a series of events where we want to really help unlock this cross-public sector collaboration that I think has been really evidenced in today's session. So thank you once again for coming along, and we hope to see you at another one of our Global Government Forum webinars soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.